Okay, Mom, tell us the story.
I was born on my grandparents' farm near McTaggart, Saskatchewan, Canada on December 19, 1922, and was named Amelia Magdalena Byerly. My mother, Wilhelmina Vogel Byerly, was called Minnie. She was the daughter of Margaret Schultz and Michael Vogel. I have no memory of my mother since she died when I was 3 months old. However, I've been told that she was a happy, good-natured girl. She had long, curly, light brown hair and loved to run in the wind and let the wind blow her hair. My grandparents, Margaret, called Grady, and Mike Vogel, raised me with their family. Their youngest daughter, Kathy, was only 2.5 years older than I. Although I knew at an early age that my real mother was dead, still I called my grandparents Mother and Dad, and their children, who were still living at home, Mike, Max, John, Ann, and Kathy, I called my brothers and sisters. Their daughters, Amelia and Matilda, who were already married, I called aunts, confusing to others, but normal to me. I have to say I felt loved and secure. No mother could have been better than my grandmother, and Ann and Kathy were especially dear to me. Philip Byerly had come to the Vogel farm as a hired man and fell in love with and married Minnie. I called him my Philip Daddy. Apparently, he must have come often. I remember him sitting on the steps leading upstairs from the kitchen. I would stand on the landing where the steps made a right-angle turn and combed his hair. I also remember him taking hold of both of my hands with one of his and lifting me up as I would jump up and fasten one of my legs under one of each of his arms and hang upside down. I thought that was great fun. My Philip Daddy died when I was 5. I was told he was heartbroken when my mother died and never took care of himself and died of pleurisy brought on by exposure. I don't really know very much about that. I still have a very vivid memory of his funeral in the Roman Catholic Church in McTaggart. The top half of the casket was open, and I was taken up to look at him. I began to cry hysterically because I thought they had cut off his legs. I was frantic because people didn't understand what I was crying about. I had a happy childhood. I've been told that, being the baby, I was spoiled, and no doubt I was. I started school at Muckamore, a little one-room country school, and enjoyed learning from the beginning. Although German was usually spoken at home, my sisters Kathy and Ann taught me English, and in fact taught me to read, and I don't recall that I ever had any difficulty at school. I got good grades in school and always was an avid reader. I was teased sometimes because if I didn't have anything else to read, I read the dictionaries. We drove to school by horse and buggy, and after Kathy quit school, I rode horseback. As I grew up, I learned to do many of the chores in the house and farmyard. Kathy and I even stooked one summer. We thought it was very hard, and it probably was for 2 young girls. Stooking was setting up the sheaves of grain TP fashion so that the grain would finish drying out, ready to be threshed. I also spent one summer on horseback herding cattle in the marsh, a sort of community pasture where the sloughs hadn't yet dried up. This was during one of the dry years when there was not sufficient grass or water in our home pasture. The cattle had to be herded so they wouldn't stray into the neighbors' crops. I grew up, as you know, through the hungry 30s. Even the farmers had to go on relief. and this was a great embarrassment to my proud grandfather. But the entire community was in the same condition. The crops were wiped out by drought, hail, plague of grasshoppers, always something each successive year. The dust storms were terrible. Dust would pool on the insides of tightly closed windows. Food had to be closely covered, or it'd be covered in dust. I don't remember ever going hungry, but I do remember going to school with no shoes. When at the age of 13, I got my first bought dress for Anne's wedding, was ordered out of the Sears catalog. I was in heaven. I still remember what it looked like. Most of my clothes were homemade until I went to work and was able to buy my own. After my brother John was married in 1937, Kathy and I moved with Mother into a little house in McTaggart. Those were happy years for Mother, I think. Since it wasn't offered in the school in McTaggart, I had to go into Weyburn for grade 12. I worked for my board for the Jeffrey family, and it wasn't easy. For example, on Monday mornings, I had to get up at 5 o'clock in order to get the laundry out on a clothesline before leaving for school. I did all the ironing, the cleaning, and much of the cooking, as well as looking after 2 small children. Housework had to be done at night after the children had been put to bed. Nevertheless, I graduated in June of 1940 at the age of 17. I wanted badly to go to college, but there was no money. Finally, my Aunt Gertie and Uncle Charlie paid my tuition at business college in Weyburn, and I again worked for my board, but this time it was with an older couple whose children were grown, so it was much easier. My first job was with Bowman Brothers in Weyburn, an automotive parts store, as secretary and bookkeeper. The manager was Jim Menzies, who introduced me to the Bible and the doctrines of a little church of which he was pastor, which is now called the Community of Christ. I had been brought up Catholic and had not really thought much about doctrine up until that time, although as a child I did attend catechism for 2 weeks every summer with a couple of nuns who came in. Of course, I was baptized as a baby. Anyway, after I was in contact with Jim Menzies, I began to read the Bible, and I studied a lot. And finally, I felt that this new faith was right for me. And so I decided to be baptized. I was baptized by immersion in the Souris River in Weyburn on November 19, 1942, at the age of 19. A hole had to be chopped in the ice for me to be baptized. But I didn't feel cold. It didn't affect me. After a broken engagement in Weyburn, I decided to move to British Columbia. I stayed over one winter in Armstrong with my cousin Min Oberly, who had married Mike Harrison-Chuck. In the spring of 1940, I moved to New Westminster and found a job with Burns & Company, a meat packing plant in Vancouver, where I was sales secretary. I learned how to deal with upwards of 20 salesmen. I lived in Burnaby and traveled by tram to Vancouver to work and New Westminster to church. It was at church that I met Merlin Miller. We fell in love and were married on July 19, 1947. Our honeymoon was spent at Reunion, a family camp at Silver Lake, Washington. I continued working until Crystal was born on December 4th, 1949, in Vancouver General Hospital. In 1952, Merlin was working as an electronics expert for a company which transferred him to Calgary. So we moved there. I went to work for an attorney. Merlin had for several years been taking a course in electronics and television and had to go to Los Angeles, California to finish it. So we moved to Los Angeles. After he got his degree there, we moved to Seattle, Washington, where Merlin's uncle Myron Beckman, his mother's brother, and family were living. Merlin got a job as a TV serviceman. Gail was born in Northgate Hospital in Seattle on November 24, 1953. In a few months, we were able to rent a house, and Grandma Miller, who had stayed in New Westminster when we moved to Calgary, came down to live with us. Later, we purchased a home in Lake City, a suburb of Seattle. We had attended church at Woodland Park in Seattle, but then began to meet with a small group in Bothell, a suburb of Seattle. And we eventually started a mission there with Merlin as pastor. Evan was born on December 11, 1959, also in Northgate Hospital. Merlin began to feel a call to work with the people in Mexico. He eventually decided we should move down to Rio Grande Valley in Texas. We sold our home, and with as many of our possessions as we could cram into a large U-Haul truck, we made the trek down to the valley in September of 1960. Merlin got a job as an engineer in the TV station in Harlingen, and we rented a house there. Merlin started driving down to Matamoros, Mexico to help with a small church group there. He started a mission at Colonia 16 on the outskirts of Matamoros. I went down with him as much as I can, and as soon as my Spanish was good enough, I began to teach the children. Eventually, a cinder block church was built, and we had a thriving congregation in Colonia 16. Those were good, productive years. I was happy to be working with the people in Mexico. The Mexican people could not have been more loving and caring, and I have many fond memories, especially of the children that we worked with. Eventually, after 5 years of working at the TV station and spending all his spare time in Mexico, Merlin was put under church appointment, and we moved to Brownsville across the river from Matamoros, and then it was much easier to go over there. But 1966 was a bad year. It came out that Merlin was involved with a woman in Matamoros, and he decided to give up church work. He got a job with a TV station in Laredo, Texas, and the family moved there during the Christmas school break in 1966. Evan, being in school, I went to work for Dr. Malikoff, an obstetrician, as a secretary. It was there that my co-workers started calling me Amy, and I liked it because I felt I wanted to be a new person, a better person, and I began calling myself Amy too. In 1968, Merlin decided to take a job as a television engineer in Saudi Arabia, and he worked over there. He came home in January 1969 and took a job in San Antonio, and we moved to San Antonio. I went to work for Dr. Phil Day. In November, Merlin went back to Saudi Arabia, and he worked in Saudi Arabia for the next 7 or 8 years, coming home only once a year for 2 or 3 weeks for vacation. The divorce was final on February 9, 1972. Crystal and I decided to take a trip to Canada. So we bought a little 15-foot camping trailer, and Crystal, Teresa, Jetty, Evan, and I set out, pulling the trailer behind the Pontiac Le Mans. It was a good way to recover from the sadness of the divorce. I bought a mobile home in which Evan and I settled down. I went to work for Dr. Maxwell Parker. I had taken 2 years in night school at San Antonio College and had earned a degree as a certified medical assistant. So I began teaching night school courses in medical assisting in 1974 and continued doing so for 8 years. I was also very active in the American Association of Medical Assistants, serving as president 1 year and chairperson of the state convention another year. Of course, I also continued being active in church, especially teaching children. I have to say, I was blessed that I was able to be with both of my daughters and my daughter-in-law Karen when they had their babies, even though I was working all the time. I was determined I would never marry again. But Dorman Lewis, who I had known at church for some years, succeeded in changing my mind. We were married on Mother's Day, May 12, 1985. We hurried it along a little because all my children and grandchildren were going to be home for Mother's Day anyway. We had a beautiful wedding at church. These last years have been happy ones. Dorman is a chiropractor and practiced out of our large home, which we remodeled completely after we were married. We have enjoyed visits from many relatives and friends over the years. Soon after we were married, we began working with the Refugee Society of San Antonio, whose chief task was settling refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Dorman and I kind of fell into directing a camp for children of refugee families at Camp Sionito, our church-owned camp at Bandera, Texas. We directed Camp Rainbow for 7 summers. It was often challenging and difficult, but very worthwhile. Of course, we drew on many church members to staff the camps, as well as staff from RSOS. Both my daughters appealed to us to move to Albuquerque so we would be closer to them, as one or both of them had made many trips to San Antonio to be with us or with me when I had my health problems. And they felt like they could look after us much better here in Albuquerque. This has been a very happy time for us. All my life, I've had a secure faith in God and in Jesus Christ, my Savior. I believe very strongly Jesus' statement that in serving others we serve Him. So service is, I think, a cornerstone of my faith. In the words of an old song, may the ones who come behind me find me.